There's a moment in life when everything stops. Not because you want it to, not because you're ready, but because time doesn't ask for permission. One day you wake up and it's just there, this realization that you've been moving so fast, working so hard, chasing so many things, that you never stop to ask yourself, did I ever really live? I met a man once who had reached that moment. He was 102 years old. He had seen wars, survived losses, built a life from nothing. But when I sat across from him that day, he wasn't talking about his victories. He wasn't talking about the businesses he built, the money he made, or the hours he spent working. He wasn't proud of any of it. He just sat there staring at the floor, hands trembling slightly over the arms of his chair, eyes lost somewhere in the past. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, like a man whispering a secret too heavy to carry any longer. The biggest mistake of my life was, he stopped. His throat moved as he swallowed, his fingers gripping the worn fabric of his chair. His breathing changed. I thought he had forgotten what he was about to say, but then I saw it. I saw it in his eyes before he even said the words. Regret. A kind of regret so deep, so raw that it hardened into something permanent. And when he finally spoke again, his voice wasn't just sad. It was haunted. I worked hard, my entire life. Another pause. His fingers tapped once against the chair like a ticking clock, but I missed what truly mattered. At first, I didn't understand. How could he say that? He had built a family, a home, a legacy. He had done everything the world tells us to do. Work hard, provide, secure the future. Yet here he was, 102 years old, staring at a wall with nothing left but time that he couldn't get back. I waited for him to explain, to tell me what exactly he had missed, to give me the lesson, the moral, the clear takeaway. But he didn't. Instead, he just sat there, breathing, thinking, remembering. And that's when it hit me. Regret isn't loud. It doesn't come crashing in like a storm. It doesn't scream in your face. It comes in the quiet. It comes when the noise is gone, when the meetings are over, when the emails stop, when the deadlines no longer matter. It comes when you finally have the time to sit with yourself. And then it speaks. It tells you all the things you should have done, the people you should have loved better, the moments you let slip away because you were always too busy. And worst of all, it doesn't leave. It stays. I remember looking at him, wanting to say something, anything, to make it better, to tell him that it wasn't too late, that he could still find meaning in the years he had left. But I didn't. Because the way he looked at me, that slow, tired gaze, told me the truth. Time was the one thing he no longer had, and as I sat there, I felt something shift inside me, a thought that has never left me since that day. We all think we have more time to fix what's broken, more time to chase our dreams, more time to live, until one day, we don't. Long pause, a heavy silence, then the final words, slow, deliberate, like a warning. By the end of this video, you'll see life differently, because what he told me that day was a wake-up call. He sat alone near the window of a small room that smelled of old wood and faded memories. The late afternoon light streamed in, stretching long shadows across the wooden floor. Outside, bare trees stood still against the winter air, their branches thin and brittle, like fingers reaching for something no longer there. He didn't say a word at first. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, veined and trembling slightly, his fingers slow and deliberate as they traced the smooth edge of his worn-out blanket. His eyes, deep set and clouded with age, carried the weight of years that had passed too quickly, years that had taken more than they had given. I had never met anyone like him before. At 102 years old, he had seen the world change in ways most of us could never comprehend. He had lived through wars, economic collapses, revolutions in technology, the rise and fall of nations. And yet, as he sat there, staring out at the cold sky beyond the window, none of it seemed to matter anymore. His silver hair was thin, combed neatly back, the last remnants of a youth long gone. His skin, fragile as paper, bore deep lines, not just of age, but of a life lived with effort, a life spent working, a life spent chasing, a life spent building. And now, at the end of it all, he sat in a room where time moved slower than it did for the rest of the world. There was no rush here, no urgency, just silence and the quiet ticking of a clock on the far wall, counting seconds he no longer tried to hold on to. He turned to me slowly, his gaze settling on my face. His expression was unreadable at first. Not sad, not angry, just tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something for too long. I had come expecting to hear the stories of a long and full life. Instead, I found myself looking at a man who had spent more time looking back than looking forward. A man who had worked hard his entire life, and yet, as I sat there across from him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something along the way, something he would never get back. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just another conversation. This was something else. This was a man standing at the very edge of life itself, staring back at the road he had walked, and realizing where he'd gone wrong. The room was silent, except for the distant, rhythmic ticking of a clock. Soft, steady, a reminder that time never truly stops. Outside the window, the sky was turning gold, the last remnants of daylight stretching thin across the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp bite of autumn, the kind that whispered of endings. Leaves drifted from the branches of an old oak tree just outside, swirling in slow, graceful circles before settling onto the ground. It was the kind of evening that made the world feel slower, quieter, like time itself was holding its breath. I sat in an old wooden chair across from him. The chair creaked slightly beneath my weight, but he didn't seem to notice. His gaze was fixed on the window, watching the light fade as though it held some unspoken secret. A small table sat between us, holding a cup of untouched tea. The steam had long since disappeared, leaving only the faint scent of chamomile in the air. It mixed with the smell of old books lining the walls, the kind of scent that carried memories of decades past. The room itself felt frozen in time. Photographs in dust-covered frames, a bookshelf filled with hardcovers whose pages had yellowed with age, a single lamp casting long shadows against the faded wallpaper. Everything about this place told a story of a man who had spent his entire life building, moving forward, only to end up here, still, waiting. For what? I wasn't sure. I watched as he shifted slightly in his chair, his hands gripping the arms as if anchoring himself to the present. The deep lines on his face caught the fading sunlight, each wrinkle a mark of time, of choices made, of roads taken and not taken. Then he took a slow breath, the kind of breath that carries weight, the kind of breath that comes before something important, something that cannot be undone. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, rushed, but it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. And what he said next froze me in my tracks. He sat in that chair like he had been there forever. The air around him was still, yet it carried the echoes of a life that had once been anything but quiet. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, were not the hands of an idle man. Even in his old age, they still bore the calluses of work, deep, ingrained, permanent. These were the hands of a man who had built something, a man who had spent a lifetime creating, striving, sacrificing. But as I looked at him now, as I watched his fingers tremble ever so slightly against the faded fabric of his chair, I wondered, was it worth it? He took another breath, deeper this time, as if pulling something from the depths of his past. Then finally he spoke. I worked hard my whole life, he said. His voice wasn't bitter. It wasn't proud. It was just tired. He had been a businessman once, not the kind who was born into wealth, but the kind who had clawed his way up from nothing. He grew up in a small town where success wasn't handed to you. You had to fight for it. You had to wake up earlier, work harder, and push further than anyone else if you ever wanted to make something of yourself. And that's exactly what he did. He started young, barely a man when he left home, setting out into a world that owed him nothing. He learned quickly that dreams meant nothing if you didn't grind. So he worked, day and night, 7 days a week. When others rested, he pushed harder. When others doubted him, he proved them wrong. And slowly, after years of relentless effort, it paid off. He built a business from the ground up. A small shop turned into a company, then into something much bigger. The kind of success people spent their lives chasing. And he did chase it. Every contract, every deal, every opportunity to climb higher, he never said no. Because in his mind, this was the goal: to succeed, to win, to build a future that no one could take from him. But success doesn't come without sacrifice. And when I asked him about the sacrifices he had made, he let out a breath, a slow, measured exhale, like a man trying to put words to something that no longer belonged to him. I missed a lot of birthdays, he finally said. I missed anniversaries. I missed first steps, first words. I missed goodnight kisses and bedtime stories. I missed Sunday dinners. I missed moments that I thought would always be there. His fingers tapped against the arm of the chair. I told myself I was doing it for them, for my family. That one day, when I had finally built enough, we'd have all the time in the world. He swallowed. But time doesn't wait. There was a pause, long enough for me to feel the weight of those words settle into the room. One day, he said, his voice quieter now, I looked up from my desk, and my children weren't children anymore. My wife had learned to live without me. The house I built felt empty, and I didn't know who I was outside of work anymore. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach sink. It wasn't just regret, it was recognition. Recognition of something lost, something that could never be reclaimed. You think you're building a life, he said, but what if, in the process, you're letting life slip away? Silence. A heavy, unbearable silence. Outside, the last of the sunlight was disappearing, the golden hues fading into soft, dusky blues. The air felt colder now, the weight of his words settling over us like an invisible fog. I wanted to say something. Anything. To tell him he had still built something, that he had still made an impact. But the way he looked at me told me that wasn't what he needed to hear. Because the truth was, he had spent a lifetime chasing something he thought would bring happiness. And in the end, all he had were numbers on a page and the echo of moments he could never get back. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that felt like the release of something buried too deep for too long. I could see it in his face. The moment he let go of whatever had been clawing at him from the inside. He looked past me, past the walls of the room, past the years that had stacked behind him like unfinished chapters in a book he wished he could rewrite. Then finally, he spoke. I spent my whole life working hard, but his voice trailed off. His hands gripped the arms of his chair just slightly, as if steadying himself. His jaw tensed, his eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in frustration. Not at me, at himself. The clock ticked. The last bit of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, casting the room in soft twilight. I waited. I could tell he was choosing his words carefully. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he had too much to say and didn't know where to begin. You know what's funny? He finally said, letting out a dry chuckle that held no amusement. I used to think I was smart. He shook his head. I really did. I thought I had it all figured out. Work hard, make money, build something, secure the future. Isn't that the way it's supposed to go? He glanced at me then, his lips pressing into a thin line before he looked away again. I thought I was making the right choices. I told myself I was doing it for them, my family, my kids, my wife. I worked late so they wouldn't have to struggle. I missed birthdays so I could build something they could rely on. I sacrificed time so one day we'd have all the time in the world. His fingers tapped once against the chair. But time doesn't wait. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. Do you know what I remember most about my son? The question caught me off guard. I stayed silent, waiting. He let out a breath. I remember coming home late one night. It was after a long meeting, one of those deals I couldn't afford to lose. I walked in the house, set my briefcase down, and I saw him sitting on the staircase, waiting for me. He must have been 6 or 7. He had school the next day, but he was sitting there fighting sleep, his little head nodding forward and snapping back up. He blinked slowly, the memory playing behind his tired eyes. I asked him, "What are you doing up so late? You should be in bed." And do you know what he said? His lips parted, but for a moment no sound came out. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I wanted to see you, Dad." A heavy silence followed. He pressed his fingers against his temple. I told him to go to bed. I told him we'd spend time together that weekend. I kissed him on the head and he went upstairs. I thought nothing of it. Just another night. His voice turned quieter. Do you know how many times I told myself this weekend? He shook his head. But weekends don't wait either. I felt something tighten in my chest. He sighed, long and heavy. I was building a life for them, and in the process, I missed actually living it with them. He rubbed his fingers together absent-mindedly, his expression unreadable. You know, I had success, he said almost to himself. I had the house, the land, the business. Everything they say a man should work for. He paused. Then, with a bitter chuckle, he said, and I would trade it all, every last dollar, for just one more dinner where I wasn't reading through contracts, for one more evening where I wasn't balancing ledgers, for one more moment where I wasn't too busy thinking about the next deal. He turned to me then, his gaze sharp, piercing. You think you're making the right choices. You think you're securing a future. But one day, you'll wake up and realize the future you were working so hard for is already gone. His voice dropped lower, and then all you'll have left are the moments you missed. The room felt colder now. The weight of his words settled over me like a fog. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. I spent my whole life working hard, he repeated, as if tasting the words in his mouth, as if letting them roll over him one last time. Then he exhaled, long and slow, and said the words that would stay with me forever. But I never stopped to ask myself, what was I working for? And in that moment, I understood. I understood everything. He sat there, his fingers rubbing idly against the chair's armrest, his breathing slow, measured, like a man trying to make peace with something that would never fully let him go. The silence between us was thick, not the kind of silence that comes from an absence of words, but the kind of silence that comes when a truth has been spoken, a truth that cannot be taken back. Finally, he inhaled, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, quieter. Success means nothing if you lose the people you love. The words didn't come out rehearsed. They didn't sound like a simple lesson, wrapped in a neat little package. They sounded like a confession, like a man telling a secret he wished he had never learned the hard way. I didn't say anything. I let the words settle, let them stretch out in the dimly lit room, wrapping around both of us like a cold wind. Then he shook his head just slightly, as if still trying to understand how everything had turned out the way it did. I thought I was doing everything right, he said. I thought that providing was enough, that as long as my family had a roof over their heads, food on the table, and a future that was secure, they would understand. He let out a slow breath. I told myself that love meant responsibility, that love meant sacrifice, that love meant working hard enough to make sure they never had to struggle. His eyes darkened, his lips pressing together into a thin line. But love isn't just about providing. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. It's about being there. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, pressing his shoulders forward, as if time itself had settled onto his back. And I wasn't there. He blinked slowly, staring down at his hands. Hands that had spent decades building, working, providing. Hands that had signed contracts, shaken deals, counted money. Hands that had done everything except hold on to the people who mattered most. He swallowed, his throat moving with effort. I missed my daughter's first recital, he murmured. His voice was so quiet I barely heard him. She was 6 years old. She had been practicing for weeks. She was so excited. She begged me to come, but I had a meeting. His fingers curled slightly against the chair. I told her I'd make it up to her, that there would be other recitals. A pause, a slow exhale, but there weren't. He closed his eyes, shaking his head. She quit ballet the next year, said it wasn't fun anymore. I felt something twist in my chest. I missed my son's baseball championship, he continued. I was supposed to be there. He had been waiting for me in the stands, looking for my face in the crowd, and I was on a train heading to close a deal. His voice dropped lower. He hit the winning home run. Another pause. And I wasn't there to see it. The room felt colder now. He never played again after that season, he whispered, said it didn't matter anymore. His lips parted as if to say something else, but he stopped. His jaw clenched, his throat tightening as he swallowed whatever words had tried to escape. He exhaled through his nose. And my wife? The air shifted. The sorrow deepened. She waited for me. His voice cracked on the last word. She waited for me for years. Through late nights, through empty dinner tables, through weekends where I promised I'd be home but never was. A long, shaky breath. I told myself I'd make it up to her, that we'd take that vacation when things settled down, that I'd slow down when the business was secure, that we had time. His fingers curled into a fist, his knuckles whitening. But time doesn't wait. The rawness in his voice cut through me. One day, I walked into the house and I realized I didn't know her anymore. his head tilted back slightly, his eyes distant. We were strangers in the same home. The finality of those words made my breath hitch. "She was always so patient with me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Always understanding, always forgiving." His fingers tapped lightly against the chair, a slow, absent rhythm. But patience has limits. He let that settle. She was gone before I ever truly saw her again. Silence. A deep, hollow silence. She spent her last days in a hospital bed, and all I could do was sit there and wish I had made different choices. He clenched his jaw, his shoulders stiffening slightly. I would have traded everything for just one more day with her. His fingers twitched. Not one more paycheck. Not one more deal. Not one more award or handshake or title. He turned to me then, his eyes burning with something that felt like both anger and sorrow. One more day. He let the words sit there, the weight of them pressing down on both of us. You don't think about it when you're young. When you're ambitious, when you're hungry for success, you think you're doing what's right. You think you're building something that will last. He shook his head. But you know what really lasts? I stayed silent, waiting, his gaze locked onto mine. The people who love you. A pause, or the empty space where they used to be. I felt something tighten in my chest. Success means nothing, he said, his voice quieter now, if you lose the people you love. He exhaled, long and slow, the sound of a man who had carried a burden too heavy for too long, and once they're gone, no amount of success will ever bring them back. The silence that followed wasn't just empty, it was unforgiving, and in that moment I understood. Because there, in that dimly lit room, sat a man who had won everything the world told him mattered and lost everything that actually did. The old man exhaled, his fingers tapping against the arm of his chair, slow and rhythmic, like a man counting moments he could never get back. His gaze drifted once more, staring past me, past the walls, past the years that separated him from the life he once had. I spent my whole life chasing things, he said finally. His voice was hollow, not empty, but stripped of illusions, stripped of the certainty he had once clung to. Money, property, titles, influence. I thought they would make me happy. I thought they would give my life meaning. That if I could just reach the next goal, just acquire the next thing, I'd finally feel complete. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. But do you know what I learned? His gaze met mine then, sharp, piercing, as if daring me to look away. None of it meant a damn thing. I swallowed, feeling the weight of his words press into me. When I was young, he continued, I used to dream about success. I imagined the life I wanted. A big house, fine clothes, a name people respected. I told myself that was happiness. That was fulfillment. That was everything. His fingers clenched slightly against the fabric of the chair. And so I worked. I sacrificed. I climbed. I spent years, decades, building an empire, gathering wealth, ensuring that I would never have to struggle the way my parents did. And I told myself it was all worth it. He inhaled a slow, tired breath. But you want to know when I finally understood? He leaned forward slightly, his expression darkening, as if he were about to reveal a truth so painful, so profound, that it had taken him a lifetime to face. The day I stood in my empty house and realized I had no one left to share it with. I felt a chill run through me. I had everything, he said, his voice quieter now. The cars, the property, the investments. I could buy whatever I wanted. I had more money than I could ever spend in a lifetime. He paused, his fingers twitching against the armrest. And yet when I came home at night, the house was silent. The halls were empty. My dining table, the one I bought because I imagined big family dinners, long conversations, laughter filling the room, sat untouched. His voice grew heavier. I built a life of things, but I lost the life that mattered. The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Do you know the strangest thing? He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as if the thought had been haunting him for years. For most of my life, I thought I was chasing happiness, but what I was really chasing was distraction. He let that sit. I filled my life with more work, more money, more ambition, because deep down, I was running from something I didn't want to face. I stayed silent, waiting. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I was running from stillness. His lips pressed together into a thin line, his eyes distant, because if I had stopped, if I had slowed down, even for a second, I would have realized something I wasn't ready to accept. He swallowed hard, that I wasn't living my life. I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. Happiness doesn't come from acquiring more, he said, shaking his head. It comes from experiencing more. He tapped his fingers against the chair again, the sound rhythmic, final. I spent years thinking happiness was something I could earn, something I could achieve, but happiness isn't a reward for hard work. He looked at me, his voice dropping lower. It's a byproduct of being present. A long pause stretched between us. Do you know what I would give? He whispered, for just one more simple evening? Just one quiet dinner with my wife without my mind being elsewhere? One afternoon where I sat with my son, truly listening to him instead of thinking about work? One moment where I wasn't rushing through life, but actually living it? His voice cracked slightly on the last words, but I was always too busy. The regret in his tone made my chest tighten. Too busy chasing things that didn't matter. Too busy working toward a future I thought would bring happiness. And all the while, the moments that actually held happiness, they were slipping through my fingers. His gaze locked onto mine. Happiness was never in the things I bought. It wasn't in the deals I made. It wasn't in the money I earned. His lips pressed together, his jaw tightening. It was in the moments I ignored. I swallowed, feeling the impact of his words settle deep in my chest. People think they have time, he murmured. They think they can put life on hold. They think they can enjoy it later. His fingers twitched slightly. Later never comes. The room fell silent again. If I could go back, he said finally, I wouldn't chase wealth. I wouldn't chase status. I wouldn't chase anything that could be taken away in an instant. His fingers tapped against the armrest one last time, a slow, deliberate rhythm. I would chase moments, a breath, because in the end, that's all we really have. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy fog. I had heard people talk about happiness before. I had read books, listened to speeches, absorbed all the cliches about what truly matters in life, but I had never felt it like this. Never heard it from a man who had lived it. A man who had lost everything that mattered, not because he didn't love, but because he thought he had time. Happiness doesn't come from what you own, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It comes from what you experience. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting back to the window. And once you realize that, it's usually too late. Narrator's voice continues, steady, heavy with the weight of time. The room feels smaller now, quieter, as if even the air itself is listening. The old man exhaled slowly, his eyes distant, as if staring at a life he could no longer touch. I thought I was winning, he said, shaking his head. For years, I truly believed I had it all figured out. I was relentless, determined, willing to do whatever it took to make sure my family never struggled the way I did growing up. His hands trembled slightly as he ran his fingers over the arm of his chair. I had nothing as a boy. No inheritance, no safety net. My father worked himself to the bone just to keep food on the table, and I swore on my own life that I would never put my children through that. His gaze darkened. So I worked, and worked, and worked. If there was an opportunity to make more, I took it. If there was a chance to climb higher, I didn't hesitate. I poured everything I had into success because I thought money was the answer to everything. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips, and for a long time, I was proud of what I built. The business, the wealth, the power. People knew my name. They respected me. I had a house people admired, a car people envied, a bank account that never ran dry. On the outside, I was the picture of success. He paused, his fingers tapping lightly against the chair. But do you know what's funny? He turned his gaze toward me, and I saw something behind his eyes that sent a shiver through me. For all the years I spent chasing money, I was never satisfied. The words hit like a hammer. I always thought if I could just hit the next goal, just make a little more, just secure one more deal, then I'd feel it. That moment of fulfillment, that feeling of finally being able to breathe, to say, I did it, I'm happy now. He let out another breath, shaking his head. But it never came. The room seemed even smaller now, the walls closing in, the weight of his realization pressing down on both of us. I reached every goal I set for myself, and each time, instead of feeling peace, I felt nothing. I swallowed hard, listening. So I kept moving the goalpost, kept telling myself just a little more, just a little longer. And do you know what happened? I stayed silent, waiting. He clenched his jaw, his expression hardening. One day, I looked around and realized I had everything I ever wanted, and I felt empty. The confession hung in the air like a shadow. Because money doesn't fill you, he continued, his voice lower now. It feeds your greed. It makes you believe fulfillment is just a little further ahead. And so, you keep chasing, and chasing, and chasing. A pause. Until one day you look back and see all the things you lost while you were too busy running. The silence that followed was unbearable. "You know when I realized how wrong I was?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. His throat moved as he swallowed hard, his hands gripping the arm of the chair a little tighter. "The day my wife died and I sat in an empty house, staring at the walls, surrounded by everything I had built, everything money could buy." A long, heavy pause, and not a single thing in that house could bring her back. He let the words settle, let them sink in. "Money gives you options," he admitted. "It gives you security, it gives you comfort, but it doesn't give you peace, it doesn't give you meaning, it doesn't give you what truly makes life worth living." Another pause. People spend their whole lives chasing money, thinking it will lead them to happiness. But money is like a mirage. You see it, you run toward it, but the closer you get, the further away it seems. He leaned back slightly, exhaling, and one day you wake up and realize you were chasing the wrong thing all along. I felt my chest tighten. "And do you know the worst part?" he asked. I shook my head. His voice was barely above a whisper now. "You can always make more money." He clenched his jaw. "But you can never make more time." The shift in his tone was subtle, but I felt it. "Time is the most valuable thing you have," he said. "And yet, it's the thing we spend the most carelessly." His fingers tapped against the chair again, the rhythm slow, methodical. When you're young, you think you have endless time. You tell yourself, "I'll do it later, I'll spend time with them later, I'll take that trip later, I'll slow down later." You think later is always there, waiting for you. A breath. But later doesn't wait. I swallowed hard. "I used to think money was my most valuable asset," he continued. "That as long as I kept making more, as long as I secured my future, I would be safe. That I would have time to enjoy it all later." He shook his head. "But time doesn't care how much money you have. Time doesn't care how hard you worked. Time doesn't pause for ambition." His voice cracked slightly. "I spent my whole life trading time for money, and now I would give up every cent I have for just one more day with the people I lost." His fingers twitched slightly. "But time doesn't sell itself back to you." A pause. "You can earn back lost money, but you can never earn back lost time." I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every word he had spoken. "Do you know what my biggest regret is?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I shook my head. "That I didn't learn this sooner." His fingers tapped against the chair one last time, as if counting something invisible. "If I could go back, I wouldn't work late. I wouldn't waste my time on things that didn't matter. I wouldn't push my family aside for one more deal." He sighed. "I would use my time wisely, because, in the end, time is the only thing that ever truly runs out." A deep, heavy silence filled the room. "Time is the only currency that matters," he murmured. A breath. "And once it's gone, you don't get any more." I swallowed the lump in my throat, realizing that I wasn't just listening to an old man's story. I was listening to a warning from someone who had spent his entire life chasing the wrong things, only to learn at the very end what truly mattered. And in that moment, I understood. Because there, in that dimly lit room, sat a man who had everything the world told him mattered, and lost everything that actually did. The room feels heavy now, but in a different way. The words I've shared with you, the wisdom I've tried to impart, it's not just his story anymore. It's our story. Have you ever found yourself so caught up in something, so convinced that it was the right path, only to look back and wonder if it was all worth it? Have you ever ignored the advice of someone who's walked this earth far longer than you, thinking they didn't understand your world, only to regret it later when it was too late? It's easy, isn't it? To be so focused on where you're going that you forget about where you are. To chase after success, wealth, titles, things that seem like they'll bring fulfillment. But somewhere along the way, you lose the moments that matter. Ask yourself, are you chasing too many things at once instead of focusing on what truly matters? I know I have. And it wasn't until I heard his story, felt the weight of his regret, that I started to question my own choices. I used to think success meant working hard. I thought it meant making money, climbing ladders, getting ahead, proving myself. I thought that's what life was about. But now I see it differently. What he shared with me changed something deep within me. I realized I was walking the same path he had walked. I was chasing things that, in the end, might leave me with nothing but an empty room and the sound of a ticking clock. Every time I feel the pressure to rush through life, to meet another deadline, to hit another milestone, I remember his words. Time is the most valuable currency. How many moments have I already missed, too focused on tomorrow instead of appreciating today? When I think about that, I realize how much of my own life has been spent chasing things that don't bring true fulfillment, things that fade away like sand slipping through your fingers. And that's the lesson he wanted to share. The one thing I think he would have told his younger self if he could go back: happiness doesn't come from what you own. It comes from who you love, what you experience, and where you choose to place your attention. So, let me ask you again, are you truly living, or are you just surviving? When you get to the end of your life, will you look back and say, I spent my time on the right things. I loved, I experienced, I was present. Or will you look back with regret and wish you had used your time differently? Imagine yourself at 90 years old. What advice would you give your younger self? Would you tell yourself to chase more, to work harder, to push yourself further? Or would you tell yourself to slow down, to appreciate the small moments that go unnoticed? Think about it. If you could go back in time, what would you do differently? What would you focus on? Would you take that trip you've been putting off? Would you spend more time with your family and less time in the office? Would you listen to the people who truly care about you instead of just chasing the next opportunity? These are the kinds of questions I wish I had asked myself earlier. Questions that force you to take a hard look at your life and evaluate whether you're on the path that truly matters. And here's the hardest truth. The path that matters most isn't the one that's paved with accolades or the money in your bank account. It's the one that's paved with memories, moments shared with loved ones, time spent in joy, in connection, in presence. I've spent so many years thinking about what I wanted to achieve, what I wanted to build. But as I've learned, the things that matter most aren't things at all. They're the people, the experiences, and the love that you build along the way. I don't know what your life looks like right now, but I know one thing for certain: you have the ability to change it, to shift your focus, to choose what really matters before it's too late. The question is, will you? This isn't just about his story or my story, it's about your story. Are you ready to start living the way that truly brings fulfillment? Or will you continue chasing things that will never fill the emptiness inside? The clock is ticking. You don't have forever. What will you do with the time you have left? I know that what you've just heard wasn't easy. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that hit closest to home. But that's why we need to hear them, right? Because deep down, we know there's always more to learn, more to reflect on, and sometimes we just need a reminder to slow down and ask ourselves the hard questions. So let me ask you now, did this story resonate with you? Because I know it touched me in ways I couldn't have imagined before. The lessons shared today aren't just his, they're ours. They're the kind of wisdom that doesn't just sit with you, but pushes you to change, to act, and to make a difference in your life right now. So if this story touched you, if you heard something in it that made you pause and think, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who's rushing through life, who's caught up in the pursuit of things that don't matter. Share this message with someone who might be missing the moments that truly make life worth living. Don't keep this wisdom to yourself. There's someone out there who could benefit from it right now. Type wisdom in the comments if this resonated with you. Let's start a conversation about what really matters. Let's talk about the ways we can shift our focus, not just from the chase for success, but toward the moments and people that give life meaning. Your words might inspire someone else to stop chasing and start living. If you love hearing wisdom from those who've walked the path before us, hit subscribe, because I promise you, the next story will be just as powerful, just as impactful, and just as thought-provoking. We're only scratching the surface here, and there's so much more to explore. The road ahead is full of lessons, moments of reflection, and stories that can change everything for you. But before we go, there's one more thing I need to share with you, a story that will leave you shocked. You won't believe what happened next. I'll share that in the next video. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. So take a moment, pause, reflect, and if you're ready, join me for the next chapter. Because life is too short not to live fully, and the time for change is now.